Guys, a quick video on the Vietnam War, a topic which can be tricky, so I just want to step you through it. Okay, the Vietnam War, really you're looking at three presidents' involvement in Vietnam, and the questions usually ask you about why America got involved in Vietnam, how they got involved in Vietnam, what they did when they were there, and why they lost, why they were unable to defeat the Viet Cong and unable to stop communism from spreading. So we're looking at three presidents. We're looking at President Kennedy, who begins the involvement. You see there with 11,000 military advisors. USA's involvement peaks under President Johnson, who by 1968 has committed 500,000 troops to Vietnam. President Johnson was very unpopular for this, and then the president who withdraws the USA from Vietnam is Richard Nixon. Okay, right. So first of all, just a wee bit of background about Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and that's what it was called up until the Second World War. When the Second World War broke out, obviously France was invaded by the Germans, and France withdrew from Indochina, and the Japanese saw their opportunity, and the Japanese invaded Indochina. But the Japanese faced this guy, Ho Chi Minh, who fought against the Japanese during the Second World War. And then when the French tried to return after the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh fought against them as well. And eventually, the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's army, the Viet Minh, defeated the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Okay. The agreement which ended that war between the French and the Viet Minh was called the Geneva Agreement. And the Geneva Agreement split Vietnam into two, with the north controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, and the south controlled by Diem. Now, Diem was a dictator, Catholic, very unpopular, and a capitalist. Okay, and he controlled South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh's aim always was to unite North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and so from 1960, Ho Chi Minh supplies a group called the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong are a guerrilla organization which attack Diem's government, and they're supplied through what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where supplies are coming from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. Now, America in this early 1960s is led by John F. Kennedy. And Americans subscribed to the domino theory, which means that if South Vietnam should fall to communism, then all these other countries in Southeast Asia will fall as well. So what Kennedy does is he sends military advisors to South Vietnam and backs up Diem's fight against the Viet Cong. Both Kennedy and Diem die in 1963, in fact, just a few weeks apart. And Kennedy is replaced by President Johnson. Okay. Now, Johnson is a different character, a bit more bullish and aggressive. And in 1964, there's an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. If I show you the map, I'll show you where the Gulf of Tonkin is. There's an incident here in the Gulf of Tonkin where a US warship called Maddox is attacked by the North Vietnamese. Johnson uses that incident to persuade Congress to pass the Tonkin Resolution. And the Tonkin Resolution at the time was described as Grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. It gave Johnson the power to go into Vietnam and do whatever he wished. So, how did Johnson use that power? Well, he launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, where American B-52 bombers bombed huge swathes of North Vietnam, including the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Later on, they would go on to use napalm and Agent Orange as well in these bombing raids. Also in 1965, the first ground troops were deployed into South Vietnam. And eventually, as I told you, by 1968, there was 100,000 American troops in Vietnam. And these troops would carry out search and destroy missions, where they would go looking for Viet Cong bases and destroy them, obviously. These missions were sometimes called Zippo missions, after the cigarette lighters that the soldiers used to burn down the Viet Cong village, the Vietnamese villages. Um, but the Americans struggled to find the enemy. The Viet Cong were a guerrilla army, quite often not wearing uniform. They blended in with the local people. And so quite often the Americans were targeting the wrong people. And in one memorable incident, the My Lai massacre, the Americans seemed to run amok and kill everyone in a village, men, women, and children. And this had a huge impact, particularly at home, where we begin to get a lot of anti-Vietnam War marches. Johnson becomes incredibly unpopular. Okay, so just rolling back from that a wee bit, the American tactics, though, were not working against the Vietnamese, and that's shown by the Tet Offensive of 1968. The Tet Offensive was an offensive by the Viet Cong, where they attacked numerous towns and cities in South Vietnam all in the one day. Um, Now, the Americans managed to stave off this offensive, but it still showed that the US tactics weren't working. And it was a turning point as the USA began to see now that this war could not be won against the Viet Cong, and they had to find a way out of Vietnam. This photograph, by the way, shows US soldiers inside the US Embassy in Saigon, where the Viet Cong had blown a hole in the wall, and the American soldiers were actually forced to fight hand in hand on the lawn of the American Embassy, which again comes as a bit of a shock to people. So, as I said, there's a lot of anti-Vietnam War marches and protests, especially across student campuses in America. And Johnson is so unpopular, Lyndon B. Johnson is so unpopular that he decides not to run for president in 1969. In that election in 1969, he's replaced by Richard Nixon. And Nixon decides on a policy of Vietnamization, which essentially means that he begins withdrawing American troops and instead supplying weapons to South Vietnamese troops to help them fight the Viet Cong. In 1973, the Viet Cong, South Vietnam and North Vietnam actually sign a treaty called the Treaty of Paris, which means that the Americans now withdraw from Vietnam. But only 2 years later, the North Vietnamese attack South Vietnam, and Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls to the communists. So you've got the fall of Saigon there in 1975, and there you've got a very famous photograph of people escaping from South Vietnam via an American helicopter from the roof of the American embassy. Okay. So the Vietnam War was a disaster for America. It cost them 58,000 soldiers' lives and $168 billion. And they failed in their objective. Their objective was to stop communism from spreading. But communism did spread. North Vietnam, the communists under Ho Chi Minh did manage to take over all of Vietnam. So that's the story of the Vietnam War, guys. I hope that sort of clears it up and you can see the key things that you've got to mention there in any question about Vietnam. Always be careful about a question about Vietnam, though, in terms of where it stops, where the timeline stops. Most of the time the question is asked, you only need to talk about Kennedy and Johnson, okay? If it goes on into 1973, you need to talk about Nixon and Vietnamization. So just be careful about the dates when you're answering a question about Vietnam. Okay, thanks for your attention and best of luck.